We would like to send out a special thanks to Manly Bands for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Manly Bands helps men find wedding bands that fit their personality and their budget with unique and stylish designs. To get 21% off your Manly Band for a limited time and get a free silicone ring, go to manlybands.com/cold. And we would also like to send out a special thanks to Acorn TV, the largest commercial-free British streaming service that features compelling stories, exclusive premieres, and originals you won't find anywhere else. To try Acorn TV free for 30 days, go to acorn.tv and use the promo code COLD in lowercase letters only. Thank you, and enjoy the show. July 16th, 1996. Nutley, New Jersey. 36-year-old Susan Walsh leaves her son in the care of her estranged husband and says she needs to go make some phone calls, but she never returns and is not heard from again. At the time, Susan had been working as a freelance journalist and an exotic dancer, but was also struggling with substance abuse and mental health issues. The investigation into Susan's disappearance explores a number of different angles, including Russian mobsters, underground vampire clubs, and an obsessive stalker, but there are no conclusive answers about what happened to her. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring a baffling missing persons case, the 1996 disappearance of Susan Walsh. This story has been featured on episodes of Unsolved Mysteries and Disappeared, and I've received numerous requests to cover it since the inception of this podcast. I decided to release it in October as part of our countdown to Halloween this year because, well, it might be the first case I've ever covered which has a connection to vampires. At the time Susan originally went missing, a lot of the media accounts put heavy focus on some of the most sensationalized aspects of the story, including underground vampire clubs and Russian organized crime figures. Of course, coverage of Susan's disappearance has become a lot more grounded in recent years, which is the approach I'm going to be taking for this episode. At the time she went missing, Susan had been attempting to build a career as a writer, as she had written an article for the Village Voice newspaper and had been a researcher on a book which recently got published, but since this did not pay enough for Susan to financially support herself and her son, she was forced to moonlight as an exotic dancer. At the time she went missing, Susan had been exhibiting paranoid behavior and seemed to believe that her work as a freelance journalist and a dancer had put her life in danger, as she may have been dealing with an obsessive stalker. However, Susan also struggled with bipolar disorder and had started using drugs and alcohol after over a decade of sobriety, so this may have played a role in her disappearance. There are a number of different theories out there about what might have happened to Susan, but no evidence that conclusively points to any of them. But since we recently passed the 25th anniversary of Susan's disappearance, I thought now would be a good time to perform an in-depth exploration. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of Susan Walsh. Our story begins in 1996 in Nutley, New Jersey, a township located in Essex County just outside New York City. Our central figure is 36-year-old Susan Walsh, who currently lives with her 11-year-old son David in a one-bedroom apartment on the ground level of a run-down brick tenement on Washington Avenue. Even though Susan is currently separated and estranged from her husband, Mark Walsh, he lives at the same address in a basement apartment below them, as the arrangement allows Susan and Mark to share the responsibility of watching over their son. At this particular point in time, Susan works as a freelance journalist and is enrolled in a master's degree program for English at New York University. After developing an interest in writing at a very young age, Susan enrolled at William Patterson University and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in English literature. However, during this time period, Susan struggled with substance abuse issues, but her big wake-up call occurred when she was arrested for drug possession on Christmas Eve in 1984 and had to call her father to bail her out of jail. After this, Susan gave up drugs and alcohol and entered rehab, and she managed to maintain her sobriety for the next 11 years. It was during this same time period when Susan got married to Mark Walsh, who worked as a house painter and a musician, and they would give birth to their son David shortly thereafter. And incidentally, Mark's half-brother just happened to be legendary rock musician Joe Walsh, who is probably best known for being a singer and guitarist in the wildly successful band The Eagles. However, by the 1990s, Susan and Mark's marriage fell apart, though they ultimately made an arrangement to live in separate apartments at the same address in order to care for their son. While she was in university, Susan wrote for their newspaper, but in order to help finance her education, she also took a side job as an exotic dancer. Following her graduation, she had aspirations of being a journalist, and since her father worked as an engineer and had some connections, Susan was able to obtain some freelance work writing for engineering and business publications. She also wrote for the pornographic magazine Screw, and for 4 years, Susan even had an on-again, off-again relationship with the magazine's publisher, Al Goldstein, though he decided to end things with her 6 weeks before she went missing. But it was Goldstein who helped put Susan in touch with James Ridgway, an investigative journalist with the New York-based alternative newspaper, The Village Voice, and she would eventually earn herself an internship with them. During her years working as an exotic dancer, Susan had built up a number of connections in the sex industry, and she was assigned to research and write an article involving Russians from New Jersey who were alleged to be involved in organized crime and would bring young Russian immigrant women to the US in order to exploit them. Even though some of these women were classically trained dancers, they would essentially be forced to work as slaves by dancing and providing sex work at strip clubs in the New York area where the Russian mobsters functioned as silent partners. While Susan worked on her article, there was apparently a lot of escalating drama, as the managers of these clubs started siding with the Russian women against the mobsters. In the end, Susan's article was finally published by the Village Voice, and she received a lot of praise for her work, but the experience also made her very paranoid, as she allegedly started receiving threats from individuals who may have been linked to organized crime. Regardless, Susan's journalism career was starting to take off, and her next assignment would involve her researching the subculture of vampire clubs in Greenwich Village, which were frequented by individuals who called themselves goths. The goths would attempt to emulate vampires by doing such things as wearing fangs and biting people, and some of them seemed to believe they were real-life vampires. They would pierce each other's skin and drink blood in a process they described as feeding, and they also reportedly drank other people's blood which they had stolen from hospitals. Susan wrote up a very detailed article about the subculture and hoped that the Village Voice would publish it around Halloween in 1995, but her editors believed that Susan's close association with the goths had clouded her journalistic objectivity. They thought she had become susceptible to believing uncorroborated stories the goths had shared with her about such things as secret murders taking place in the vampire world. Indeed, Susan had also started dating one of the goths, a young man named Christian Peppo, who was 15 years younger than Susan, and would eventually move in with her and her son. The Village Voice decided not to run Susan's article and asked for a rewrite, and it was ultimately never published. During this time period, Susan's writing work was not providing her with enough income in order to pay the bills, take care of her son, and pursue her master's degree, so she wound up returning to exotic dancing for additional money, and it was mostly performed at go-go bars. According to the landlords at her tenement, there were times when Susan struggled to pay the rent, so they would allow her to pay it off in portions. On the afternoon of July the 16th, Susan's best friend, Melissa Hines, decided to travel to her apartment after Susan failed to respond to a number of pages she sent her. When Melissa discovered that no one was there, she subsequently left and returned a short time later, where she wound up crossing paths with Mark and David, who were both returning from a shopping trip to Staples to buy school supplies. According to Mark, Susan had showed up at his apartment at around noon and had asked him to watch over David. Even though Susan's current boyfriend, Christian Peppo, was living with her and David, he was sleeping at the time, so Susan told Mark she needed to step out to run some errands and make some calls from a nearby payphone. Susan did not own a phone, but even though Mark owned one and would occasionally let her use it, he always insisted on knowing who Susan was calling. If Susan wanted to keep her calls private, she would leave to use a payphone located about a half block from her apartment. On this particular day, she told Mark she needed to call her agent, who helped book her dancing gigs, but said she would be back in about half an hour. However, Susan never did return, and a few hours later, Mark took David out shopping. After Christian woke up, he had spent about 45 minutes watching a movie with David before he left the apartment and hopped on a bus to New York City 1 hour later, which is why no one was home when Melissa first arrived. Since Susan did not own a car, she often arranged for one of her friends to give her rides to work. This friend would show up at Susan's apartment at 5 p.m. that afternoon to pick her up, but she was not there, and even after he waited for an hour, she failed to surface. Finally, at around noon the following day, Melissa spoke to Mark on the phone, and he told her that he had not heard from Susan in 24 hours and had just reported her missing to the Nutley Police Department. A search of Susan's apartment would reveal that she had left all of her personal belongings behind, including her purse, keys, and pager. Investigators focused on the nearby payphone Susan ordinarily used, but were unable to obtain a record of any outgoing calls which were made from it, and no witnesses could confirm actually having seen Susan use the phone. But curiously, there was an eyewitness who worked at a pizza parlor across the street, who recalled having seen Susan walk back inside her apartment that day. During the early stages of the investigation, both Mark and Christian were interviewed, but neither of them were considered to be suspects. Christian claimed that he had no idea where Susan was going when she left the apartment or who she was planning to call. He moved out a few weeks after Susan went missing, and Mark assumed the responsibility of caring for David. At the time Susan went missing, she seemed to be doing well professionally and had been working on a number of different projects, but she was dealing with a lot of turmoil in her personal life. After over 11 years of sobriety, she had started drinking again and using drugs, and was also combining them with Xanax, the prescribed anti-anxiety drug she was taking. Susan also struggled with bipolar disorder, and the medication she took to treat it was still inside her apartment when she vanished. The reason Melissa Hines had gone to Susan's apartment on the afternoon she went missing was because Melissa and another friend had decided earlier that morning that they were going to stage an intervention and convince Susan to enter rehab. Melissa found it concerning that Susan had supposedly left her apartment to make a phone call to her agent, as Melissa believed he was a shady character who would reportedly help Susan score drugs. The month before Susan went missing, a book titled Red Light Inside the Sex Industry was released, which was written by James Ridgway and featured pictures from Village Voice photographer Sylvia Plaichy. It explored the corruption and criminal element within the sex industry in New York and New Jersey, and given Susan's experience in that field, she was hired to do the primary research. She received credit as a research associate, and the book also published photos of Susan's work as an exotic dancer. When Red Light was released, Susan could be seen selling copies of it at establishments on Washington Avenue near where she lived, but when she vanished, and missing persons flyers started being posted throughout the area, some people initially thought the whole thing was nothing more than a gimmick to help promote the book. While Susan was proud of her work on Red Light, Ridgway became concerned when he saw Susan at the publisher's party and noticed that her wrists were bandaged. This suggested that Susan may have attempted suicide, though she denied this was the case. Since Ridgway believed that Susan was drinking again, he advised her to go to Alcoholics Anonymous, but she assured him that she was fine and would seek the necessary help if she ever needed it. For this reason, Ridgway has always suspected that on the day Susan disappeared, she may have met up with someone to take drugs and overdosed, so this person panicked and disposed of her body. Another project that Susan had been working on was a documentary titled Stripped, directed by an old friend of hers named Jill Morley. The documentary focused on women who worked in the sex industry, and only 2 days before Susan went missing, Morley recorded a group interview in which Susan was one of the participants. Susan said that when she first started exotic dancing in university, she was enthralled by the money and the lifestyle, but since she re-entered the profession during the 1990s, she had grown to detest it, and only continued doing the job because she needed the income to support herself. She admitted that this played a role in ending over 11 years of sobriety for her, stating, quote, "It's draining me. I've been in it 4.5 years, 4 years too long, I'd say, and I'm stuck in this conundrum because I feel so drained. And I'm damaged right now, I will admit that. Very damaged from this business. I'm hurting very bad." End quote. Indeed, Susan was frequently becoming sick during this time period, and on the day this interview was recorded, she told Morley that she was suffering from bronchitis, emphysema, and an ulcer. She said she had already been in the hospital twice that week and was feeling depressed and going through mood swings. One of the most unsettling moments which occurred during the interview was when Susan's pager suddenly went off and she remarked, quote, "Oh, that must be my stalker." Even though everyone in the room laughed at the remark, a lot of her friends believed this was a serious problem Susan was facing, as they would often witness her pager go off every few minutes while they were around her during this time period. One person that Christian Peppo named as a potential stalker was an ex-boyfriend named Billy Walker, who had met Susan 2.5 years earlier while she was dancing at a go-go club he managed. Susan and Billy even lived together at her apartment for a while before the relationship ended, and he moved out in November of 1995. 2 months before she went missing, Susan filed an order of protection against Billy, and according to Christian, Billy called up Susan repeatedly in the weeks prior to her disappearance, and she supposedly made a recording of him threatening her. There were reports of Susan filing domestic violence complaints against Billy, and at one point, he even showed up at the apartment and assaulted Christian. In spite of this, Christian claimed that Susan was still having sex and using drugs with Billy around the time period she went missing, but investigators never turned up any evidence that Billy was involved in Susan's disappearance. The Nutley Police Department explored the possibility that Susan could have disappeared on her own, as they spoke to over a dozen witnesses who believed they had seen Susan alive after the day she went missing. One of these witnesses was a sex worker who claimed she had crossed paths with Susan while she was selling herself on the streets of Newark and decided to take her into her apartment and give her a place to stay for 2 weeks. The woman apparently said that she didn't want to return home, and if the police made her do so, she would kill herself. She also apparently shared details about her personal life which aligned with Susan's life, and some of these details had not yet been released publicly when the sex worker came forward. However, Susan's friends and family remained skeptical of the sex worker's story and thought she might have fabricated the whole thing. However, 1 month after Susan went missing, Melissa Hines would provide her own eyewitness sighting when she reported having seen Susan climb into a limousine with another man. Melissa took down the license number and turned it over to the police, who subsequently tracked down the owner. This man did confirm that he had been with a blonde woman matching Susan's description on the night in question, and when shown photographs of Susan, he said he believed it was the same woman, but could not make a positive identification. Most everyone who knew Susan did not believe she ran away voluntarily, because in spite of what personal problems she might have been experiencing, she was considered to be a very devoted mother who never would have abandoned her son. In fact, according to Melissa, before she vanished, Susan had expressed a desire to move to Florida with David in order to start over, as some of her cousins lived there, and she reportedly had a new job lined up. However, Susan did feel that her Village Voice article about Russian organized crime figures had put her life in danger, and she believed that contracts had been put out on her life. Melissa did confirm that there were times she was with Susan when she believed she saw cars following them. She theorized that Susan might have decided to go into hiding because she thought that staying away from David would be the best way to protect him from whoever was after her. At one point, she did write a letter for her son, in which she essentially said that if anything ever happened to her, she wanted him to know that she loved him very much. Susan's case would be profiled on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, which aired in January of 1997, and 1 month later, her story was featured in an episode of the radio program This American Life, titled 3 Women and the Sex Industry. In 2005, the case wound up in the hands of a new investigator, Detective Lieutenant Steve Rogers, who re-examined the evidence and uncovered an intriguing clue which had been overlooked before. A 1996 wall calendar had been collected from Susan's apartment, but Rogers noticed that the entire page for the month of July was missing. Since Susan's handwriting was all over the pages of the preceding months in the calendar, this led to speculation that Susan had written something on the July page which she or someone else did not want anyone seeing. Police attempted to re-interview Mark Walsh, who was still living at the same tenement, and they asked to perform forensic testing of Mark's apartment. However, even though Mark had been very cooperative during the initial stages of the investigation, he refused to grant permission for the testing, and got his attorney to contact the Nutley PD on his behalf to say that he would no longer be speaking with them. During this time period, it was reported that investigators were searching a reservoir behind Mark's father's house in the nearby township of Montclair, as Susan often liked to go for strolls there. They were also looking for a van which Mark had owned in 1996, as an eyewitness had apparently seen Mark loading a rug in there on the same day Susan disappeared. In spite of this, the Nutley PD still stated that they did not consider Mark to be a suspect. By this point, David was 21 years old, and according to the July 9, 2006 edition of the Record newspaper, he was stationed in Hawaii with the Marines as a nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons specialist. When the case was featured on an episode of Disappeared in January of 2012, Detective Lieutenant Rogers was interviewed and stated that he had uncovered a new piece of evidence in the case file which he found to be very interesting and may have had something to do with a relationship between Susan and someone else, but he declined to share any specific details about it publicly. In December of 2020, Susan's half-brother, Arthur Merchant, was interviewed for the Passaic County-based newspaper, the Herald News. Even though they were not close during their childhood, Arthur claimed that he built up a strong relationship with Susan as they got older, and she had encouraged him to come out as gay in 1995. Arthur said that he last spoke to his sister on the phone a few weeks before she went missing, and thought she sounded very weird, as Susan talked about helping the FBI, the CIA, and the Justice Department with a case, and abruptly ended the call when she said she needed to catch someone named Roseanne. Susan and Arthur's father, Floyd Merchant, passed away in 2013, and 3 months before his interview was published, Arthur filed a lawsuit against the Nutley Police Department for information on the case, as Floyd had once hired a private investigator who turned his findings over to the police, and Arthur now wanted to access them. Unfortunately, even though 25 years have passed, and so many different theories have been pushed around about Susan Walsh's disappearance, there are still no conclusive answers about what actually happened to her. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to send out a special thanks to Manly Bands for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Manly Bands helps men find wedding bands that fit their personality and their budget with unique and stylish designs. So how this works is that you'll start the process by getting their Manly ring sizer to ensure that the ring you've purchased will fit you perfectly during work and play. Once you know your size, you'll go through the fun process of choosing from their wide selection of materials, which include gold, wood, antler, steel, and even dinosaur bone. And you can also choose from one of Manly Band's curated collections, such as the Jack Daniel's Whiskey Barrel Collection. Once you've selected your band, you get free shipping worldwide, a 30-day exchange policy, and a free warranty. Now, I've previously shared the story about how our podcast's very own editor/producer, McGill, decided to order a black zirconium from Manly Bands known as the Fitzgerald, because when he originally got married to his wife Caitlin several years ago, they could not afford wedding rings for each other. But Manly Bands provided him with the perfect opportunity to finally get one, and he selected the comfortable Fitzgerald brand as it has some very stylish 14K rose gold plating on the sides. Thanks to some fantastic customer service, Manly Bands did a perfect job at ensuring that McGill got the right size and it would be shipped to him in a timely fashion, and he has been wearing the Fitzgerald ever since. But even if you're someone who already has your own wedding band, Manly Bands is a great place to get an additional band which perfectly suits your personality. So to get 21% off your Manly Band for a limited time, go to manlybands.com/cold. Plus, you'll get a free silicone ring. That's manlybands.com/cold for 21% off for a limited time. We would also like to take a few moments to thank our newest sponsor, Acorn TV. We're currently in the middle of autumn and winter is almost upon us, so as the temperature decreases, I love to conclude my day watching TV while I'm curled up and cozy on the couch. Especially if the shows are must-watch, like the ones I'm always finding on Acorn TV. Acorn TV is the largest commercial-free British streaming service that features compelling stories and exclusive premieres. There's always something new to discover, as it has hundreds of exclusive shows from around the world, including award-winning mysteries, dramas, comedies, and so much more. And since Acorn TV has new releases every week, you'll never have to worry about running out of content, and you get thousands of hours for a fraction of the cost to compare to most streaming services at just $5.99 per month. I've just got myself started on Acorn TV, which is so easy to stream on your favorite device. Of course, if you're listening to a true crime podcast, you're probably interested in dramatic TV series which are based on real-life crimes, and you'll find a great one on Acorn TV titled Manhunt. It is based on the diaries of Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton, who was betrayed by Martin Clunes, and Series 1 focused on the pursuit of notorious serial killer Levi Belfield, while Series 2 focuses on the notorious serial rapist who targeted the elderly. The perpetrator caused a 17-year reign of terror over southeast London, as his crimes went unsolved for a very long time. But Colin Sutton became involved in that particular case just before he retired, and helped solve it in a matter of weeks, taking an incredibly dangerous serial rapist off the streets. Manhunt is just one of the many excellent series you'll find on this streaming service. So try Acorn TV free for 30 days by going to acorn.tv and use promo code COLD in all lowercase letters. That's acorn.tv with promo code COLD in all lowercase letters only to get your first 30 days for free. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. Anyway, one of the primary themes of the episodes I'm releasing this year as part of my countdown to Halloween is that I'll be covering unsolved cold cases which have been sensationalized due to an alleged connection to something supernatural. If you listened to the episode I released last week about the 1945 murder of Charles Walton, you'll know that I spent a good chunk of the time debunking the rumors and urban legends which involved his death being connected to witchcraft. Well, if you were to follow the media coverage during the first year or so following Susan Walsh's disappearance, you'll find a lot of emphasis placed on the so-called vampire angle. Like I mentioned earlier, Susan spent a lot of time frequenting underground vampire clubs in New York and exploring a subculture involving individuals known as goths, who led lifestyles in which they pretended to be vampires. Hell, some of them even seemed to believe they were vampires, though that all may have been part of the act. Of course, the Unsolved Mysteries segment on this case spent some time on that angle, as did the tabloids, the New York Post, and the New York Daily News. In September of 1996, less than 2 months after Susan went missing, the British newspaper The Independent published an extensive article titled Missing, Presumed Undead, which did a deep dive into this entire vampire subculture. At one point, they mentioned a vampire-themed shop owned by a woman named the Reverend Lady Armida, who referred to herself as the quote-unquote Witch of the East Village. When asked about her regular customers, she stated, quote, "They do kill people, you know. I think Walsh got done in by a degenerated man. I'm working on trying to find out where she's stashed," end quote. In 1998, author Catherine Ramsland, who has often written about vampirism, published a book about Susan's case titled Piercing the Darkness, Undercover with Vampires in America Today. After performing her own investigation into underground vampire clubs and goths, Ramsland concluded that even though the people in that community did perform some macabre rituals, such as blood consumption and consensual blood sharing, the whole thing was nothing more than a harmless fantasy involving benign individuals. In the end, she ultimately concluded that it had no real connection with Susan's disappearance, because even though Ramsland spent a lot of time exploring this subculture, she never encountered anyone who put up resistance to her digging into the case. Indeed, as the years have gone on, the focus on the vampire angle has significantly decreased, and it was only given a brief mention in the Disappeared episode about the case from 2012. One of the main reasons it likely held some significance was because Susan's current boyfriend, Christian Peppo, was a goth whom she had met while working on her article, and he was living at her apartment at the time she went missing. However, Christian was never considered to be a suspect in her disappearance, and given the timeline of events, it seems impossible that he could have been involved. But what's unique about this case is that there are just so many potential theories about what could have happened to Susan, but no significant evidence which points to any of them in particular. In addition to the whole angle involving vampirism, we also have a sensationalized theory involving the Russian mob, as well as the possibility that Susan was harmed by a stalker. However, it's entirely possible that Susan's disappearance was tied to her struggles with substance abuse and mental health issues, and at the time, there was a decent possibility that she could have disappeared of her own volition and was still alive somewhere. Interestingly enough, Unsolved Mysteries once produced a segment on a woman named Dorothy Allison, a self-proclaimed psychic detective who worked with the police on a number of investigations, and she also happened to live in Nutley, New Jersey. Not surprisingly, Allison was brought in to assist with Susan's case, and at the outset, Allison says she strongly felt that Susan had not been murdered and did not believe she was in any jeopardy. But of course, we have now passed the 25th anniversary of Susan's disappearance, so even if by chance Susan did take off on her own, the chances of her still being alive after all this time are pretty remote. What adds an extra element of sadness to this story is that we have video of Susan being interviewed for a documentary called Stripped, and it was filmed only 2 days before she disappeared. In most missing persons cases, the general public only gets to see the victim through photographs, but this is one of those rare cases where you can actually view footage of them speaking a short time before they went missing and get a glimpse into their mindset at that time. I've seen the clip of the moment where Susan's pager goes off while she's speaking, and she remarks, quote, "That must be my stalker." Well, Susan gives off the impression that she's joking, and everyone else in the room just laughs the whole thing off. It is pretty eerie to watch now, knowing that she will vanish without a trace within the next 48 hours. By all accounts, Susan was not in a good place at that time, as she had recently started drinking and doing drugs again after over 11 years of sobriety. She was struggling with bipolar disorder, seemed to be sick all the time, and showed signs that she was feeling suicidal. 1 month earlier, James Ridgway noticed that Susan had bandages on her wrist and was concerned that she had made a suicide attempt, though she completely downplayed the whole thing. To be fair, Susan's boyfriend was a goth, and one aspect of their subculture was piercing each other's skin and drinking blood, so this could provide an alternate explanation for Susan's bandaged wrists, though I'm not sure if she ever clarified what actually caused them. On the surface, it did not appear that Susan took off voluntarily, since she left virtually all of her personal possessions behind at her apartment, but if she was feeling suicidal, or desperate to obtain drugs, or suffering from a serious mental health crisis, that could explain why she left and never returned. The one thing that most people from Susan's personal life did agree on was that she was a very devoted mother who truly loved her son David and never would have done anything to willingly abandon him, no matter what personal problems she was facing. But of course, Susan had been exhibiting a lot of paranoid and erratic behavior before she went missing, and seemed to believe her life was in danger, so if she wasn't in her right state of mind, she still could have taken off. Susan seemed to believe that the Russian mob had put out a contract on her life, and may have made the deliberate decision to stay away from David in order to protect him. And even if this so-called contract hit was nothing more than a paranoid fantasy in her own mind, she may have legitimately believed it was real and gone into hiding. Susan's medication to treat her bipolar disorder was left behind, and it's unclear when she last took it, but it's reasonable to assume that her condition would only worsen without it. But let's go back and look at the actual series of events on the day of Susan's disappearance. Even though she had been separated and estranged from her husband Mark for years, it sounds like they never went through the process of getting a divorce and lived in separate apartments at the same address. There seem to be differing accounts out there about their financial situation, as they obviously did not have a lot of money, and it's unclear if Susan was single-handedly responsible for earning all their income, but regardless, it was convenient for Susan to have Mark watch over their son whenever she had to work. I think what's unusual about the day of Susan's disappearance is that she specifically asked Mark to watch over David while she stepped out, even though her boyfriend, Christian Peppo, was living in her apartment and was present at that time. It sounds like Christian was still sleeping when Susan left, so that might be why she asked Mark to watch David instead, but some people have taken this as a sign that Susan knew or had a feeling she might not be coming back, which is why she wanted to ensure that David was cared for if something happened to her. Even though Mark and Susan were estranged, Mark did continue raising David for the next several years after she vanished, something she could not rely on Christian to do. Of course, on the surface, it seemed like Susan only planned to be gone from the apartment for a short time in order to make some calls at the payphone down the block. I mentioned earlier that Susan did not own a phone, and Mark would let her use his from time to time, but she would go to use the payphone if the call was something private she did not want Mark to hear. Susan did tell Mark that she was planning to call her agent, who arranged her bookings to dance in go-go clubs, but since it's been alleged that this agent helped supply people with drugs, this could have been the main reason for her call. But the big unanswered question is, did Susan actually make any calls from the payphone, or did something happen to her before this took place? Or better yet, could Susan have actually made it back to her apartment? After all, there was an eyewitness from the pizza parlor across the street who claimed they saw Susan entering the tenement that same day, even though Mark claimed that he never saw her again after she left. Well, even though investigators have repeatedly stated that Mark is not a suspect and was very cooperative with them at the time, he became decidedly less cooperative as the years went on, as he refused to allow police to perform forensic testing at his apartment, and he got an attorney to speak on his behalf. On the Disappeared episode, Detective Lieutenant Steve Rogers confirmed that he did not necessarily take this as a sign that Mark was hiding something, as he may have just simply decided that he wanted to move on after all these years. However, if you go to the official Unsolved Mysteries website and bring up the profile page for Susan Walsh, you'll find a very interesting and lengthy comment there from January of 2017 by a poster under the username Sam Frank. Now, all the information in this comment is completely unverified, and for all we know, it might be nothing more than a load of bunk. But since I often see this comment mentioned during online discussions about this case, I have to address it. According to Sam Frank, he learned a bunch of interesting new information when he became friends with Mark Walsh's brother, though to clarify, this was not Joe Walsh of the Eagles fame, but a completely different brother. Long story short, the scenario presented is that Mark got into a heated argument with Susan inside his apartment, which led to him smashing her across the head with a frying pan, and it wound up killing Susan, and he later disposed of her body. Now, given the timeline, this scenario might seem impossible, as both Christian and David would still have been in Susan's apartment when this supposedly happened. We know that Christian left and got a bus to New York City just under 2 hours after Susan left, and Mark subsequently took David on a shopping trip to Staples, a fact which was verified by Susan's friend Melissa Hines, since she was waiting at the apartment when Mark and David arrived home later that afternoon. Given that he was with his son during this time period, it seems impossible that Mark would have been able to dispose of Susan's body, but according to the commenter, since Mark lived in a basement apartment, he was able to keep Susan hidden down there for a while and got rid of her body at a later time, presumably in the middle of the night while David was sleeping. Once again, this is all unverified info from an anonymous internet commenter, so take it with a huge grain of salt, but the commenter said he did contact the police about this, and even though they never publicly said so, I do get the impression that police might have explored this potential scenario. The Nutley PD did perform a search of a reservoir located behind a house belonging to Mark's father, and they also said they were looking for a van Mark once owned, as he had reportedly been seen placing a rug in there on the day Susan went missing. However, it does not sound like these leads ever went anywhere, and the police have still never openly considered Mark to be a suspect or person of interest. But regardless, we still have to explore this option as a possible theory. Obviously, if Susan and Mark were able to live at the same address sharing custody of David for years, they must have been able to maintain a cordial relationship. However, Melissa claims that shortly before she went missing, Susan had expressed a desire to take David and move to Florida in order to make a fresh start. If true, it's possible that Mark may not have been thrilled about Susan taking their son to another state over 1,000 miles away, so perhaps this led to an argument that escalated into violence. There's also the odd detail about Susan's calendar having the page for the month of July torn out, suggesting that there might have been something written down there that someone did not want the authorities to see. It's possible that Susan tore out the page herself before she left, but Mark also would have had access to the apartment and the calendar and had the opportunity to get rid of the page if there was something written on there that he wanted to cover up. Since Christian lived there, he also would have been able to get rid of the page, but he's never done anything to arouse suspicion or indicate that he had any knowledge or involvement in what happened to Susan. Nearly a decade passed before investigators even noticed that the July page was missing, so we can only speculate on when or why it was torn out. Susan apparently used this calendar a lot to write down information, so she may have written about something she was planning to do or someone she was planning to meet on July the 16th, which would shed some light on her disappearance. Overall, even though the earliest media coverage of this case gave no indication that Mark could have been involved in Susan's disappearance, I can see why that idea is not completely implausible, but until law enforcement openly expresses their belief that Mark was complicit, I will probably lean towards an alternate explanation for what happened to Susan. Okay, so we've already pretty much debunked the vampire angle, but what about the theory that Susan was the victim of a contract hit orchestrated by Russian organized crime figures? Susan's Village Voice article about the mob's control of local strip clubs and their exploitation of Russian immigrant women did make some waves, and Susan apparently received some threats over the whole thing. But as the years have gone by, it sounds like investigators have pretty much dismissed the entire organized crime theory. Prior to her disappearance, a number of people heard Susan express her belief that her life was in danger, but how much of that was paranoia that may have been due to her mental health or substance abuse issues? After all, Susan did not just mention the Russian mob, but implied that she was mixed up in something involving such organizations as the FBI and the CIA, which comes across as someone who is losing their grip on reality. I think my biggest issue with this theory is that Susan's disappearance took place about a year or so after her article was published, so even if she did anger some figures in organized crime, why would they wait so long to come after her? Much like the underground vampire clubs, this does sound like an angle which was heavily sensationalized during the initial coverage of this case, but as time goes on, the evidence just seems to point in other directions. Of course, that isn't to say that Susan was not the victim of foul play, but if she was murdered, it seems likely that the crime was a lot more personal. Or alternatively, Susan's disappearance was not the result of a murder, but rather an accidental drug overdose or a suicide. There were definitely hints that Susan was feeling depressed and suicidal at that time, but of course, if she decided to take her own life, what happened to her body? Well, Nutley is in fairly close proximity to a number of bodies of water, so if Susan decided to end her life in that fashion, her body could have conceivably been carried out into the Atlantic Ocean. But we also do have to seriously explore the possibility that Susan ran away on her own, since we have numerous reported eyewitness sightings of her being alive in the weeks following her disappearance. Of course, you're going to get mistaken eyewitness sightings in missing persons cases all the time, but here, we have a sex worker who claimed that Susan stayed at her apartment for 2 weeks, and revealed specific details about her personal life which matched Susan's own life, such as her living arrangements with her husband and son. Some of Susan's friends and family were skeptical of this woman's story, but investigators did confirm that she shared accurate details about Susan which were not public knowledge. If this woman was Susan, then it sounds like she was in a very bad place at the time, as she was homeless and working the streets in order to survive, but she also apparently said she would kill herself if the police forced her to return home. No matter what Susan may have been going through at the time, that does seem like a very harsh and out-of-character remark for her to say, since the one consistent thing about her is how devoted she was to her son. Could this have been a case of Susan being so ashamed of what she'd become that she would have rather died than allowed David to see her like that? And if the sex worker's story was true, what happened to Susan after they parted ways? When Melissa Hines was interviewed on the Disappeared episode, she openly expressed her belief that the story was completely fabricated, but it's interesting how Melissa once provided her own eyewitness sighting of Susan. Melissa claimed it occurred only 1 month after Susan originally went missing, and that she saw her climbing into a limousine with another man. You have to give this sighting additional credence, since Melissa was Susan's best friend, and not just some random stranger who saw Susan's face on her missing poster. But on the other hand, even though this sighting was prominently featured on the Unsolved Mysteries episode from 1997, there was no mention of it at all on the Disappeared episode 15 years later, making me wonder if police had completely discounted it by that point. It is odd that investigators were able to track down this man from the limo and showed him Susan's photo, and even though he felt pretty sure that the woman he was with was Susan, he could not make a positive identification. You might be confused about why he couldn't be certain about something like that, but reading between the lines, I wonder if this means he picked the woman up for sex and never learned her real name, which is why it cannot be conclusively established if she was Susan. Regardless, I get the impression that investigators no longer put much credence into the sighting, as Melissa may have seen another blonde woman, and it was just wishful thinking that she thought it was her missing friend. So now we have to consider the possibility that Susan was murdered or abducted after exiting her apartment to use the payphone. Even though I have doubts that she was being targeted by the Russian mob, it does seem pretty likely that Susan was being tormented by one or more stalkers. We have that footage of Susan's pager going off during an interview, and even though her remark about it being her stalker was just written off as a joke at the time, there were other people who corroborated that they would hear the pager beeping every few minutes whenever they were around Susan, which does suggest that someone out there was obsessed with her. As someone who performed as an exotic dancer in some pretty seedy clubs, Susan easily could have attracted the attention of a customer who developed a fixation on her. One particularly problematic potential suspect was Susan's ex-boyfriend Billy Walker, who had a history of domestic violence and was clearly still obsessed with her, so much so that Susan had filed an order of protection against him. Christian Peppo has never hesitated to publicly express his suspicions about Billy, which isn't too surprising, considering that he was physically assaulted by him and witnessed Billy's violent, threatening behavior firsthand. I know Billy was investigated by police, though I'm not sure if they ever checked his alibi or verified his whereabouts on the day Susan went missing in order to rule him out as a suspect. Regardless, it does not seem like they were able to uncover any evidence that he was responsible for her disappearance. The final possibility which has been presented is that Susan was not actually a victim of foul play, but died of a drug overdose in the presence of someone who panicked and disposed of her body. Given the absence of hard evidence pointing to foul play or a specific suspect, this does seem like one of the more plausible theories. After struggling with drugs and alcohol throughout the 1980s, Susan managed to become sober and remained that way for over 11 years, but she clearly had a relapse before she went missing. During her interview for the Strip documentary, Susan indicated that her continued reliance on exotic dancing played a role in this, as she had become repulsed by the whole lifestyle, but still felt she had to keep it up because her writing career wasn't going to pay the bills or provide enough income to support her son. You can almost consider it a catch-22, as Susan's experience and connections in the sex industry are what allowed her to get her foot in the door at the Village Voice, yet she seemed unable to pull herself away from it. Her attempt to research and write an article about underground vampire clubs was something different, but I think she considered it a major blow when it never got published, as all the projects she worked on after that were related to exotic dancing and the sex industry. It does sound like Susan was proud of her research work on the book Red Light Inside the Sex Industry, but she admitted that the whole business had left her so drained and damaged that she was feeling physically ill all the time. Combine that with her struggles with bipolar disorder, and you can understand why she turned to drugs and alcohol again. So if Susan went to score drugs on the day she went missing, and someone disposed of her body, who could it have been? It's a shame that investigators were unable to obtain a record of calls made from the payphone Susan liked to use, because it could have shed a whole lot of light on the situation. If it turned out that Susan never made any calls, then it seems more likely that something else happened to her. Like I mentioned earlier, Susan said she was planning to call her booking agent, a man who was known for allegedly supplying people with drugs, but I'm not entirely sure if this man was ever investigated. I do think the key to solving this case might be the missing page from Susan's calendar, as she may have written down her plans or the contact information for someone she was planning to meet on July the 16th. Without it, we really don't know what Susan might have been planning to do that day. The other key detail that's worth mentioning are the remarks from Detective Lieutenant Rogers on the Disappeared episode about how he uncovered an interesting new piece of evidence in the case file which may have been connected to a relationship between Susan and someone else. But since he declined to share details about it, and we haven't learned anything new this past decade, we can only speculate on what this evidence is or how it fits into things. Otherwise, it's really difficult to form a concrete theory about what might have happened to Susan, because there are just so many different possibilities. But I do think this is one of those cold cases where you can probably discount the most sensationalistic aspects, such as the vampires and the Russian mob, as the answer is likely connected to the victim's personal life. Overall, Susan Walsh sounded like a very interesting person who struggled a lot with her personal demons and just never got that big break which could have allowed her to live a comfortable, stable life. Whatever personal issues she might have had, it sounds like the one constant with Susan was that she was a very good mother, and the biggest tragedy in this case is that David has had to spend the last 25 years of his life without knowing what happened to her. I have no idea what David has been up to since 2006, but since a newspaper article from that year stated he was a nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons specialist in the Marines, he was obviously doing quite well, and I'm sure his mother would have been proud of him. This is definitely a perplexing mystery, but David and everyone else who cared for Susan deserve a conclusive resolution. So if you happen to have any information on the disappearance of Susan Walsh, please contact the Nutley Police Department at 973-284-4940. That's 973-284-4940. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Last month, we released a sequel to a popular Patreon episode we did a few years ago titled The Trail Went Hot, and this time, I go over a number of cases which were featured in articles I wrote for listverse.com over the years and have since wound up being solved. As a token of appreciation for recently cracking the milestone of 500 Patreon supporters, we are making this particular episode available to all of our patrons in tiers 1, 2, and 3. I'm also going to be dropping the occasional exclusive bonus Patreon episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, and we recently released an episode in which myself and my co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discussed the unsolved abduction of Angela Hammond. And for our patrons in tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Matthew E., Murdercast, Susie S., The Crime Lines Podcast, Sarah W., and Betsy W. Thank you so much for your support. Also, I wanted to announce that this coming Saturday, October the 23rd, at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, The Trail Went Cold is going to be holding another live watch marathon where we'll be screening classic segments of Unsolved Mysteries, in which you can chat with myself or your fellow listeners while you view them. And of course, given that we're so close to Halloween, we'll be screening some ghost, UFO, and paranormal themed segments this time around. We've included a link to our screening room in the show notes, and it's also currently pinned to the top of our social media pages, and you can also find it in our Facebook discussion group. So once again, our live watch is taking place this coming Saturday, October the 23rd at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and we hope to see you there. In addition, I wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday as we complete our countdown to Halloween and present another creepy episode of The Trail Went Cold.